Today I'd like to continue our journey through the book of Deuteronomy up to the beginning of chapter 19. We did a little bit of chapter 19 on our last video on chapter 18. And we were talking there about the so-called cities of refuge. And this was a very interesting development. It was set up for those people who had committed a homicide, but it wasn't an intentional, it was kind of an accidental homicide. And so to protect them, they set up these special cities of refuge so they could go to these cities and be safe in these cities, because when there's a homicide, sometimes people, their emotion kind of gets the better of them and they lash out, they try to get revenge, and all of a sudden it's somebody who's innocent and they are harmed. So they had set up 3 cities. An example of an accidental type of homicide might be somebody chopping down a tree, the blade accidentally flies off, kills someone, they didn't intend it, but again, this would be something that people would certainly be upset about. So they said if the land expands and they have more land and they decide to conquer other cities and other peoples, as sometimes happens, then they could add an additional 3 cities, because they would need, obviously, more cities in that situation. But if someone has committed an intentional homicide and they go to one of these cities of refuge, as some people might, they might say, well, I committed this homicide, it was intentional, it was deliberate, but I want to escape it, I want to escape the consequences of it. Why don't I go to one of these cities of refuge and just tell them it was accidental, when in fact it was not. If they go, though, but one of the elders from that home city might go to the city of refuge and remove them to be punished by the person they call the avenger of blood. And the avenger of blood would usually be a close family relative. So after the judgment was made, the person could be stoned to death, the person could be killed because they had committed a homicide, and that was the retribution, the punishment for a homicide would be that you would be killed yourself. So a lot of times people might want to pull a caper and they might say, gee, I'll go to that city, and they were going under false pretenses, but in that case they could certainly be removed from the city. They also said in chapter 19 that you cannot remove that your neighbor's landmarks erected by your forefathers in the promised land. So if the forefathers in the promised land had put up a certain landmark, you're not allowed to remove that. You have to kind of reverence that, because that would be something that they put up. We noticed several times as we journeyed through the early part of the Bible, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, some of the patriarchs and some of their children would put up these special landmarks. Sometimes they would be of stone and they would offer special sacrifice there. These were to be respected. You couldn't just put them down and destroy them. No, that was not a good thing to do. Now, what about establishing something that is a fact? A lot of times we go back and forth, even on our own culture. What is a true fact? What is what is something that is just made up? What is something that is an out lie? People go back and forth to trying to establish, well, what really did happen? What really took place? We see it a lot of times in trials. We see it in the news media. Sometimes they have to print a retraction. No, this did not happen. So to establish a judicial fact, Moses speaks about this in the book of Deuteronomy, and he says he has this wisdom from God about it. And you need 2 or 3 witnesses to establish a judicial fact. So 1 witness, not sufficient. 2 witnesses, good. 3 witnesses, even better. That was the optimum. Because sometimes witnesses can lie, and so having that 3rd witness could be very helpful. And we see a situation like that as we journey further on into the book of Daniel. We'll see a situation where some of these witnesses were actually lying. If witness is found to be false in the testimony given, what will happen? Well, that witness will receive the same punishment that he was seeking for the accused. So if you were seeking capital punishment and you were lying about it, not too good. The consequences would be capital punishment for you. So by establishing this standard, the thought would be people would be less reluctant to come forward with false testimony because there would be real consequences for false testimony, as there are in our own judicial system. If there is perjury, there is consequences for perjury. And then in chapter 19, verse 21, we have the famous passage, life for eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, and foot for foot. So there's equivalent punishment. So if you've taken a life, your life is taken. If you pluck out somebody's eye, your eye goes out. Tooth for tooth, if you knock somebody's teeth out. If you harm their hand, your hand, foot for foot. So this was to balance things out. And also to establish that there are consequences. If you harm somebody, if you do them some physical harm, there are going to be consequences to yourself. Sometimes people look at this famous law that was established in the book of Deuteronomy and they say it's excessively harsh. But actually, for its time, it was really more moderate because the revenge factor was sometimes overwhelming, and sometimes the punishments were really out of sync with the crime that had been committed. So the idea was to moderate a little bit by establishing the sense of fairness, and people could see it. You've harmed somebody's hand, your hand should be harmed as well. But again, this would be in terms of a crime that was intentional and were there at least 2 or 3 witnesses. As we journey on to chapter 20, we see Moses saying that we should not be afraid to face an enemy that will outnumber us, which is a very interesting statement by Moses. And that was many times, we're going to see as we go further into the books of Joshua and Judges and Kings, we're going to see that was indeed the situation. The enemy did outnumber them. So this teaching of Moses really is reflective of the experience of the people, as we have seen that many of these teachings in Deuteronomy were actually reflective of what was actually happening to the people as they were in the promised land. And the idea was that if the enemy outnumbered you and there was this type of situation, do not worry, do not be afraid. Why? The teaching was simple. God will be with you. If your cause is just, if it is right, God will be with you and God will assist you, even though you are outnumbered. And that was the consolation of the people, that God was with them in their struggles. God would not abandon them. God would not forget them. God would be with them. When they are going out to battle, the priest will lead you in prayer to overcome your fears. God will go with you and give you the victory. So this was the idea. The priest would go out first. The priest would lead you in prayers. It's interesting, even today, we have this concept with chaplains. Chaplains leading religious services before battle to calm people's fears, to help them. This was the same idea, that the priest would be there, the priest would pray with them, would calm down their fears, and God would be with them. And really a very important concept throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, the presence of God with the people.